Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening if you're joining from some other part of the world. My name is Aanand Krishnan, and I'm with Tala Security, and I'm really happy to be chatting with Mounir of Juniper Threat Labs. This is a fireside chat, which means that there'll be back and forth between me and Mounir, and we'll have some time allocated towards the end for Q&A. So, as you know, the topic of discussion today is going to be primarily Magecart, which is obviously a very top of mind topical thing for CISOs and information security organizations worldwide. I'll start with a quick introduction of myself and the company, and then I'll pass it over to Mounir. So I, along with my co-founders, we founded Tala a few years ago now because we were at Symantec, and at Symantec we spent a lot of time looking at point of sale skimming attacks, credit card skimming attacks, and there were a lot of them, especially in the 2013 2014 timeframe. Target and other retailers got hit. And when we started researching this topic, we sort of asked ourselves a very, at that time, innocuous question, which was, given that people are shopping more and more online, people are banking more online, healthcare is moving online, how would these sort of attacks translate into the online world? And that set us off in a journey into looking at the modern web, how modern websites are architected. And we discovered so many vulnerabilities and sort of a large security gap that it was fairly obvious to us that not only would these attacks translate from the physical world into the online world, but that they would be successful and be able to operate at scale. And a bittersweet way, our thesis came true in the last couple of years. We've seen groups like Magecart sort of drive a truck through that gap. And that's really where we are today. So I'm very happy to be chatting with Mounir, who spends a lot of time hunting down threats at Juniper. Mounir, I would love to hear a little bit about your background.
Good morning, Anand. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I really appreciate these kind of fireside chats, a little bit informal. I think that we can convey a lot more to people listening, especially when we focus on the things that we really care about, not necessarily focused on any product pitch or anything. So I've been the head of Juniper Threat Labs for a little bit over 3 years now. And before that, I was also the head of Threat Labs at a startup called Cyfort, which was focused on the detection of malicious activity. And we kind of pioneered a little bit some of the work around machine learning and sandboxing. And we got acquired by Juniper. That's how I ended up here. And I also spent some time at Cisco as well as Ironport in the days where I was doing email security as well as web security.
I wanted to start with your broad take on the threat landscape, right? We're obviously coming into the shopping season, and I think one of the main focuses of this conversation is to try to help retailers, especially as they're heading into the shopping season. But I'd like to start, Mounir, with your take on what you're seeing more broadly in the threat landscape, and then maybe get into Magecart.
Yeah, you're right. We're coming up to the shopping season. But let's not forget, we've been in the online shopping season for the last 8 months. So we're getting a little bit used to this thing. When we think about securing those kind of online transactions, there are really two big pieces that come to mind for me. As on the one hand, you have the vendors themselves who have to deal with these kind of security challenges. And then on the other hand, you have the consumers who have to get these services online. So the threats that they both face, although on the surface they seem to be a little bit comparative, but down deep they're really not. If you go to an online retailer today and you tell them what is your biggest concern, I'll guarantee you they'll tell you ransomware, because they're really afraid of this particular threat that's hitting a lot of businesses. And they are right in thinking so, because the ransomware attack happens to be an immediate disruption to their business. Right? When your servers are down, you're losing customers. And when you see those attacks being a little bit more focused, I mean, we started seeing far fewer the spray and pray type of ransomware attacks. And that's probably also because the endpoint AVs have become good enough that they can actually spot and deter these kind of attacks. But more importantly, it's because the threat actors have figured out that the money is somewhere else. So they'll go to the businesses before they'll come to you. So think of the Ryuk ransomware, for example, the Crisis Dharma, which still hits some individuals, and the Maze, which apparently shut down. I don't know if you've seen that in the news last week, but they're saying they're shutting down. I'll wait and see, Because typically these kind of operations means, well, we're getting a little bit too close to being discovered. Let's just revamp everything.
Bail out for a little
Start
bit
over.
or reorganize. Yeah. A lot of
Exactly.
hospitals are getting, I mean, I actually have friends and doctors and a lot of them are like, hey, Anand, how do I help my hospital? So I think they're definitely changing their focus, right? Away from the consumer
Right.
towards sort of where they can get the more money. One of the things interesting for me was, Mounir, earlier on in the year, you had mentioned that in one of the blogs that you wrote that Magecart would be one of the top threats of 2020. I think clearly your prediction came true, and I'd love to kind of rewind back to the beginning of 2020 when we were not yet in this kind of post-COVID world. What prompted you to come to that conclusion?
I mean, it's very simple. You just look at the news. Think about British Airways, for example, pretty big at that time. And I could tell from what we were seeing that this kind of identity theft is here to stay for a little while, because we didn't really have a good grasp on how it works. And the end users are really helpless in those kind of situations. So from the retailer side, it's really the theft of PII and credit card information that's the moneymaker for the threat actors. So usually you see like a couple of different dumps of credit cards. The ones that contain those codes, that's what they call the CVV, the security code on the card, and those that don't. Now, for people to understand like what's the difference between the two, on the one hand, you have the ones that come from skimming at retailer sites. Like, for example, the kind of things you find, you must have seen stories of people putting skimmers on gas stations, for example.
Gas station, yep.
That's the kind of situation where you get the card dump, you get the actual credit card number, but you don't really get the CVV code. Right. When a piece of malware is also put in point of sale type of environment, you also do not get that CVV code. So you're only getting a credit card. And the difference here is that has limited value, because what the threat guys do with that is they'll go and actually manufacture real cards with those numbers. And they can only use them in so many places. You cannot really use them online, because today, most online shoppers would be required to enter that security code for the credit card. And the threat actors don't have it. So they shifted to this other means that would actually give them the mother load of everything, which is, let's go to these websites that have shopping carts and let's pick up the information from their credit cards, including the CVV code from those kind of attacks. It's like when you see this kind of dynamic happening, you know where the future is. And for me, it was relatively easy to recognize that this is the bigger threat next year on the online shopping.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a very interesting observation. I wanted to spend maybe a couple of more minutes on just that, right? Which is the idea that if an attacker steals credit card information from a physical credit card swipe, they only get the magnetic stripe data. And I think that the only option they have is to create a fake credit card and then use it at another place, like a Starbucks or a grocery store, which happens a lot. But because of the chip that now people have in the credit cards, it's much harder to duplicate that physical credit card. And that's one of the things we saw again in the 2013-14 timeframe. There was a lot of focus on EMV and other chip technologies that all the major credit card companies started to adopt, especially in Europe and then the United States. So again, if you look into the psychology of the attacker, right, the attacker is always trying to move into the place where they can get the easiest, quickest return. They're trying to steal information and dump it into a dark web and get money right away. And they recognize that it's much easier to perpetuate these attacks and also get a quick buck. The other thing that we noticed in our studies earlier on, this was 2-3 years ago, we started looking at how sort of the web itself was architected, Mounir, right? We looked at the fact that people were using, for example, web application firewalls for PCI standards compliance, but a WAF doesn't really know what's happening at the browser level. And we looked at the modern web and we said a lot of this is driven by JavaScript and all of that executes at the browser. And then we said, well, where does this JavaScript come from? And that's where the kind of Pandora's box sort of opened up, where we looked at the supply chain of what's happening inside a website. And that's when the bulbs went on for us, because a lot of these attacks, even that happen in the physical world, are because of third parties, right? Target was because of sort of their HVAC vendor, for example. And when we looked at the complexity of the supply chain on the web, it was kind of obvious to us that attackers had so many options now, and there was no visibility. So I'd love to kind of get your perspective on the supply chain angle and whether that factored into your earlier thinking into Magecart as well.
Yeah, very clearly. I mean, when I started looking at the very first attacks on Magecart, it was early on. So you got to think of the Magecart attacks are not one mold, right? They come out of a few varieties. And the very first one was relatively simple. They kind of took one particular shopping cart, which was very popular. And when I say shopping cart, I mean the software that builds shopping cart for websites. It was very popular, used a lot. It's called the Magento shopping cart. And they inserted their own malicious code into that shopping cart. So they knew exactly where to go. They knew exactly how to insert it. But that's just one technique that they would use. And they started evolving. And you could see things like leveraging vendors' plugins. So sometimes some website would have plugins to make you do like rate this or rate that. And those are plugins. And then they recognize that, oh, if that thing actually shows up on the same page as the page you're using for payment, then it can actually be a vehicle for injecting the JavaScript. And then they started using ad servers, because even as you're paying for a product that you're buying, you still see some ads popping up on your screen.
Right.
And those ads, when they're not very well monitored, they're actually a vehicle for the same kind of injections. And finally, you've seen them move into more elaborate schemes when they wanted to go after really high traffic websites. And that was the case for British Airways, for instance, where they actually infiltrated the domain. They understood all the code. They figured out where exactly to implant the skimming code, and they went for that. So when you look at these 4 different techniques in injecting, 3 of them are supply chain attacks, and only 1 isn't. So obviously the numbers and the statistics are saying that you're going to have a lot more supply chain type of injection than direct code injection within your own website. So that's, to me, it's a very clear indicator that the problem is a little bit bigger than what you, as an owner of a domain or a website, can directly do with your own code. It goes far beyond your own code.
Right. And I think that is definitely one of the hardest problems to solve, especially because you don't control the code. Those vendors are updating their code on their own cadence. So, all the traditional approach of vulnerability scanning and all of that simply doesn't pan out. I read one of your earlier blogs about the attack on Focus Camera and your investigation into it. I'd love to get a little bit of sort of history of how that happened, if you may. And then secondly, Mounir, for us, we spend a lot of time on Magecart trying to figure out how to defend against Magecart. We'll get into solutions later on. But I'd love for the listeners to get some perspective on what's happening behind the scenes when a threat researcher like yourself operating at Juniper Threat Labs, how do you go about investigating Magecart? What happened when you were looking at Focus Camera?
Actually, I didn't share that before today specifically, but when you read that blog, it's written at the 3rd person. But the reality is that thing actually happened to me personally.
Okay.
And I was thinking, oh boy, these guys have fallen into the wrong hands. So what happened at the time is that I received a text message from my credit card issuer saying that, hey, you just made a purchase for an airline ticket to the Philippines for like $2,600. And I'm looking at, what time did this happen? It was 5 a.m. So I recognized immediately that something was wrong. And I called the credit card issuer and I had them, of course, block the transaction. So the transaction really didn't settle. So, nobody was able to take any funds from the credit card issuer. But then I started thinking, this is clearly some sort of identity information theft that's going on. And I needed to figure out where could that have happened. So I started tracing my steps backwards and thinking, this particular credit card, where have I used it last? But it's pretty hard to think that Amazon would have been a target of a breach and you wouldn't know about it. So I discarded a lot of the places where I didn't think it was happening. And then I realized that about a month before that, I had made a purchase on a website I usually do not purchase from. So I decided to go investigate. So I opened up that website and I immediately went into the shopping cart. And I kind of knew that it was going to be like Magecart. So I got to the shopping cart And then I turned on all the tools, like the development tools, whatnot, into your browser, turned on Wireshark, start getting packet captures. And sure enough, I mean, it was right there in front of me. You could see that I was typing fake credit card numbers, and and I see them going to two different places. I'm like, that just doesn't sound right. Why would the payment information go to two different places? And that's how I started, unraveling the whole thing. It turns out the site itself was injected with some code. The code was obfuscated. And the funny thing is, when they obfuscate the code, they obfuscate it in ways that are easy to identify. It was like a big blob of base 64 JavaScript in there with an eval function at the beginning. So you go like, yeah, I don't think people usually write code like this. So we started looking at that. It turns out the threat actors had picked up a domain name which is very similar to the domain name that's typically used by the shopping cart, which is something that belongs to Citrix Zendesk, but it has nothing to do with Citrix. Right? They just they added one extra letter in the code, in the domain name, so that whomever is looking at the code may not think much about it. You read it fast and you think, oh yeah, this is whatever that Zendesk site was. But reality is it was a malicious website. I realized that the domain was registered just about a couple of months before that. And I knew immediately, these are all the hallmarks of a Magecart type attack. So I immediately contacted the owner of the website and the online store, which happened to be an actual brick and mortar store. They just have an online presence. So, within a day, they were able to identify what we were pointing at them, and they cleaned up the site. And that's the story.
Still, I think it's fascinating. I think we're seeing a divergence in terms of the attackers. I think Magecart is sort of an umbrella term, Mounir, right? Like any sort of card skimmer is called Magecart. I think the point that I think people still haven't gotten around is you can steal credit cards, but you can also steal credentials. You can, break into an application and steal admin credentials. You can steal people's social security number and all kinds of other PII, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that the attackers, from our perspective, are getting more and more sophisticated. And, our predictions are that we're only in the first innings, maybe, or the second innings of this Magecart problem. And there's still a long way to go. And we're still dealing with it on a whack-a-mole basis. What is your longer-term prediction in terms of how long we're going to be dealing with this Magecart menace?
I think that we're going to be dealing with it for quite a long time. And the reason for that is very simple. We do not have yet a method of payment that would guarantee the integrity of transactions without giving some sort of a breach or an exploit capability for a threat actor who actually goes after it and has the means to go after it. Today, it's relatively simple. I mean, a lot of websites happen to be not very well protected. They tend to have easy to exploit vulnerabilities. So it's relatively easy to go in and implant some additional code that does the skimming that people want to do. Whether it's large scale or not is another story, but it's doable. Tomorrow, as we move to something a little bit better, I think that bad guys are still going to figure out ways to get in there. So I think we're going to be dealing with this problem for a long time, because it's also a natural transition for us going from like currency and hard cash into electronic currency, into even anonymous currency when you think about Bitcoins and Monero and all cryptocurrencies. But still, even there's the ability for the threat actors to be able to do something. They're still doing the same kind of skimming that exists today for credit cards. That's why, in my view, we're going to be dealing with this problem for a long time.
Yeah, it's one of the frustrations, perhaps, that threat researchers would face when talking to retailers. I think it's changing now, but Mounir, when we talk to a lot of companies, they're saying, we don't worry about credit card theft because we tokenize everything. And, a lot of times people don't recognize that things like tokenization only protect the data after it's being sent back to the server. While you're in the browser, everything is in the clear, right? Everything that the user enters, the users aren't entering encrypted data. They're just typing their keyboards, right? So if the attacker is in the browser, essentially they have a lot of privilege. And I think when we look at the web today, the way we think about it is this, there's authentication, like you can authenticate and say, yeah, this is the right server, but there's no access control of the browser. Any JavaScript has the same privilege level pretty much as the first party domain, which means that if you're compromising an Amazon S3 bucket because it's misconfigured, you can end up, with these massive spray and pray kind of Magecart attacks as well. We also find that one of the reasons why, at least historically, companies haven't worried about Magecart is they didn't know that they were attacked, or they didn't know that they had been compromised. Because in order for you to know that you've been compromised, you need to be looking in the right place. And that's what we usually ask them, like, oh yeah, we don't worry about Magecart, we haven't seen it. Well, are you looking for it? If you're not, if you don't have the right tools, you won't be able to know that it's happening.
That's right. Yeah, maybe 3 days ago, I was reading a story about an online gold seller. And they have been notified that their website has been hacked and that there's a skimming operation going on. So apparently, the skimming operation started in February of 2020, this year, right? And they got notified somewhere in July. The skimming operation went on for 5 months, and they had absolutely no idea.
Right.
And even when, according to the report, even when they were notified that this thing was going on, it still took them 10 days to figure out exactly what's going on and remove the skimming codes from their website. So you're absolutely right. This thing is a silent threat, and it's very hard to trace. Imagine somebody whose credit card was picked up in February. Do you think that by now they're going to trace their way back and go, oh, it happened to me when I went to this website? There's no way they're going to make that connection. So it's very difficult for the website owners, if they're not looking for that information, like you said, to be aware that it's going on. And that's unfortunately the dilemma.
Yeah, and we have seen malware samples that are actually collecting not just credit cards, basically they're keyloggers. They're reading anything you're entering, right? Because if you're a sophisticated hacker, you might want to steal credentials, or you might want to steal other sort of information. And yeah, I think the visibility into these attacks is really missing because the technologies frankly don't exist. You have to, as you said, open up the Chrome developer console and look for that, right? But how many people actually do that? And there is no automated technology until very recently to be able to monitor for what's happening at the browser level.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And honestly, I don't want to blame the users for this. I'm not going to ask anybody to open a developer's tool and go check a website card before you start entering your credit card information. So that's really not an option here. But you're right. I mean, the client side is really a huge problem, and it's certainly something that needs to be resolved at the business level.
Yeah, I want to touch upon the supply chain angle again. We at Tala, one of the things that we do is we constantly scour the internet. We look at all the major websites in the world, and we look at how are these websites constructed. And what we find is, especially in the retail world, we find that the average retailer has something like 39 to 40 different sources of JavaScript alone. We're not talking about images or CSS, or all of which can be, by the way, used for data exfiltration, right? It's not just JavaScript. There are CSS techniques for data exfiltration, but just focusing on JavaScript, there are 40. And, I've been having this conversation with many enterprises, large and small, and there's not a single person in any of the companies who actually knows who those 40 are, who added them, why they added them, was there a vetting process? One of the things that you found out in your investigation of that Magecart attack was that domain was registered not so long ago. That's usually a good sign that something could be wrong here. And it's amazing how the ecosystem, the supply chain of a website, it just keeps increasing because of marketing and other parts of the organization that keep adding code and tags and pixels. And you end up with this gargantuan supply chain, and nobody knows why they exist. And it's a privacy issue as well, but I'd love to get your take on what you're seeing.
That is true. I would say it's not as simple as that. Most of the large online retail stores that we know of have an actual physical presence, right? It's a brick and mortar business to begin with. The online presence is not front and center in the executive team's mind. And when it comes to building these websites, and especially the shopping carts, they tend to just outsource that entirely. So you'll find some other organization which is responsible for your website and probably your shopping cart as well. And they might themselves outsource this information, this capability to yet another party. So you end up with a long chain of custody for who is really responsible for information you type into their browser and how do they get to your payment site. So all of that makes it a little bit more difficult for people to kind of take responsibility and go, you know what, I need to conduct regular penetration testing of my website. I need to do an audit of the source code on my website. They don't necessarily think of it as one of their direct properties, right? That creates a problem because at that point, nobody really feels that responsibility. There is a little bit of, I would say, reputation at stake, sure. But then again, it's not the people who build the shopping experience who are going to be the website owners usually.
Right.
And that's where we have that dichotomy. And
right.
It's very hard for one to get into the business of the other. And who knows what you get into when you go outsource your code.
Yeah, and I think one of the good things that has happened is that I think PCI, for example, the PCI standards body came out with a bulletin last year. They've actually done talks about Magecart, which is great because they've been sort of focused on getting retailers prepared. They've been talking about, hey, retailers, you should be scanning your website, removing malware, implementing security controls. One of the interesting things is for privacy, right? The biggest visibility into Magecart actually has come not through security, but through the privacy angle. As companies like British Airways, they've gotten fined tens of millions of dollars. They ended up paying recently. So GDPR and CCPA and PDPA and all the things that are happening in Latin America have the secondary effect of actually shedding a light on Magecart and actually making companies responsible. So it's no longer a hot potato and say it's not my responsibility. So now I think we're seeing that change. We have about 10 minutes before we jump into Q&A, Mounir. I wanted to switch gears and maybe talk about solutions. I'd love to maybe start with your perspective on what kind of solutions are you seeing, or what would you recommend retailers do as they head into this holiday season?
So in terms of solutions, there is no silver bullet for this whole thing.
Yeah.
But when I wrote that blog initially, I kind of talked about the simple solution of just hashing the content. What I was really talking about there is doing something called SRI, like sub-resource integrity. It basically allows you to protect your content by making sure that it didn't get modified along the way. Now, realize that especially for the big retailers online, their website is not served from one location. It's served from multiple locations, and some of it goes through a third party, called the content delivery network, like Akamai and other similar companies. But that means there is even more opportunity for something wrong to go on with your code. But the SRI basically allows you to sign effectively your code and saying, this piece of JavaScript, this is its signature. If the signature doesn't match on the browser side, then something is wrong and don't execute it. And the good news is that the web browsers already support this kind of capability. So
Right.
All you have to do as an owner of a website is to introduce these additional configurations that would add these kind of signatures to your code and make sure that it doesn't get modified along the way. So that's one way to deal with it. But there's also a number of other standard-based approaches, like using what is called content security policies. And content security policies, again, is something that is supported by browsers as well as web servers. So you can, for example, specify, as far as I know, here are the domain names that are allowed to fetch executable scripts on my behalf. So when it comes to the browser, that's part of the difficulty, right, for the website owner, because everything happens on the browser. They don't necessarily see what's going on there. But in your code, you can say, I'm only authorizing the browser to download scripts on my behalf if it's coming from one of these domains. So if you do that, you're kind of closing a lot of the avenues that a Magecart type approach is using to infiltrate an endpoint JavaScript. But that's not the whole story. I mean, these will go a long way, but you also have to identify all the third-party e-commerce and online advertising that you might be working with hey, maybe you can have this conversation with them and they do their own self-assessment, but you can do also some audits for them. And that's the difficult part. I mean, people are not easily going to let you audit their code, but you can at least require that their code be audited by a trusted third party. And one thing I want to stress here, a lot of the times to avoid problems of scripts being injected through a supply chain is to say, you know what, I'm going to take that whole code from this third party and I'm going to host it myself.
Right.
When you bring that code in-house and you monitor it and you don't necessarily update by default, then it's under your control.
Right.
That's not what always happens, unfortunately, because people are really tempted to say, look, if there is a security update on that code, I don't want to be late, therefore I'm just going to read it from its original source all the time.
Right.
Please do not do that. That's like the worst thing you can do. It's you have no idea who's going and modifying those scripts in GitHub or whatever else you're getting them from. So having a little bit more ownership of the code, don't rely on too many third parties, could be another one option to save.
Yeah, I think we've been obviously tracking sort of this Magecart solution space for a while, and broadly we see three approaches, Mounir, right? One is the what I would call scanning approach, where you're using a scanner and you're basically saying, can you help me detect if there's a Magecart skimmer on the site, right? And the scanner would crawl through your site and would look for some Magecart IOC and say, okay, well, you have Magecart or not. Then you have the approach of standards based, right? Which is to implement content security policy, sub-resource integrity, used by Google and lots of very well-known organizations worldwide. And then you have the third approach, which is I'm going to inject my own JavaScript in real time into the browser and look for what's happening in the DOM. Mm-hmm. Our take, and this is just Tala's take, is there is no silver bullet, really. You have to sort of use a silver buckshot approach, which is we're still early on in the Magecart battle. We recommend to companies that they implement maybe all three, right? Mm-hmm. Except we understand that each of them has its own downfalls. Like if you're just using a scanning solution, make sure your scanner is accessing all those critical workflows. They're able to see what's happening in the shopping cart page as opposed to just the home page, which may not have the skimmer activated. If you're using JavaScript virtualization or some kind of injection, guess what? Keep an eye on performance, because the performance is going to degrade quite considerably. I mean, we see if you inject JavaScript, you could end up with a couple of seconds of delays on your website, which could be a killer when it comes to your revenue. And more importantly, if you use JavaScript injection as a technique, guess what? The attacker can see all that code. They can reverse engineer, they can look at what you're doing in real time and modify their, so, there's benefits and downfalls to everything, even with content security policy, sub-resource integrity, which are very powerful standards. And we, obviously, Tala, we help automate all of those. What we see is they're not easy to do. These technologies are not easy to implement. Only a handful of companies in the world are really doing it successfully, which is why our approach is take all of these approaches and put it in one platform, which is what we've done. We've taken the scanning approach, we've taken the JavaScript injection approach, and we've taken the standardized technologies, HTML5, W3C standards, and packed it into one platform with the understanding that this will give you probably the best defense in depth, but with the caveat that this is a moving target. The attackers are going to get smarter, and this is not like you set it and forget it, right? You're trying to protect a dynamic website, which is changing all the time, right?
I have a way of putting this, and I really appreciate your perspective on this. I usually say that this cybersecurity is a race with no finish line.
Exactly. And I think when it comes to Magecart, we're only, I think, in the early innings, and the best recommendation that we tell customers is defense in depth. Try to make use of all these freely available tools. Obviously use vendors like Tala when you think that makes sense. I want to finish off with the consumer's viewpoint, right? What kind of perspectives do you have to offer about what consumers could potentially do other than don't go to seedy websites, and if something offers 95% off on your favorite product, just don't go there because that might be malware infested. What is your advice to consumers?
Well, there's not much running away from this. I don't feel good trying to put any of the blame on the consumers. It's just a tough problem for them to solve. But there are some smaller things that they can do to just help themselves safeguard against these kind of attacks. The simplest things is don't register in every website you go. You don't really need to. Do I want to give my birthday to yet another website? No, they're not going to send you gifts on your birthday. So what's the harm in giving them a slightly different date that is not yours? Just doesn't matter. If they get breached and somebody gets a hold of that data, who cares? It's not your real birth date. I would also urge people not to jump for the easy button that says register with Facebook or connect with Google or any, because you have no idea how much information you're exchanging with that third party as soon as you allow Facebook or Google to give your information to those third parties.
Got it. Perfect, Mounir. I would love to spend a few minutes taking questions. I already see a few questions coming online. All right. What would you recommend as a roadmap for companies interested in solving this problem? I think, hashing through things like sub-resource integrity, using content security policy, that's usually a good place to start, right? We also think that scanning your website is useful, right? I think to me, the biggest challenge that companies face in dealing with Magecart is frankly the people problem. Convincing management that this is something that's really critical, that, here's my risk. And I think starting with a risk assessment, going to your CIO, CISO and saying, look, I've looked at all our websites and we have a massive supply chain and I have no idea what the supply chain is and integrity. So I feel like just understanding your risks is probably step number one, and then implementing these security controls is a very good thing, but there's a lot more you can do. But what about you, Mounir?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there has to be visibility not only at the CISO level, but sometimes at the board level, because these kind of issues are very much going to impact the good standing of the company in the eyes of the public. And publicity is never a good thing when you're a target of a cyber breach that has succeeded. So from that perspective, the board has to understand that you're dealing with sometimes a make or break situation for the company. If all you're doing is this online business, then it really becomes absolutely critical. But now people start understanding that given the visibility that some of these things have, especially in light of the regulations that are in place and that mandating disclosures, they are starting to listen a little bit more to what the CISO has to say. I would argue that if you're not looking at Magecart type attacks and ransomware type attacks, then something is off in your security posture.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that's come up, how widespread is this problem? In other words, what percentage of websites operating today have this vulnerability? I mean, it's a very hard question to answer. I think our scanning of the web tells you that only maybe a percentage of the web has any kind of protection, frankly, against Magecart type attacks. So this is a problem that's I think we dealt with this in the network world where SSL TLS, we went from pretty much 0% to close to 80% now, right? Over the last 6-7 years. Same thing is going to happen on the client side. We're still very early, but how widespread do you think this problem is, Mounir?
I think it's extremely widespread. You got to think though that this is not just a Magecart / credit card information theft problem, right? This is
Right.
a bigger PII problem, and sometimes people are not looking for your credit card number, but they're looking for your bank information. So
Correct.
a lot of the Trojan horses, like the ICE ID banking Trojan, for instance, is huge out there. And that's why we keep talking about, is the problem big on the internet scale? Not only is it big on the online retailer scale.
Right, exactly.
So when you combine all of this together, all these different reasons why people want to get your private information and steal it, then yes, it's pretty much very widespread, unfortunately.
Yep. One last question, Mounir. I see these attacks in the news frequently. What has been the real impact of these attacks? That's the last question, and we can end with that. I mean, from our perspective, we're seeing privacy violations, GDPR fines, CCPA lawsuits, class action lawsuits. In some cases, a direct impact on stock performance. But But more recently, what's interesting, when we're seeing that cyber ratings, cyber insurance, cybersecurity ratings companies are looking at your websites. And one of the things that they look for is, are you protected against the client side attack surface? And they're looking for, have you implemented content security policy? Have you implemented sub-resource integrity and other things? And if you haven't, they give you a lower rating. And so that impacts your premium almost directly. So there are lots of ways in which companies are getting impacted, not just through breaches per se, but what is your take?
Yeah, I totally agree with you on this one. There's the cybersecurity ratings are becoming more and more important. And if I am to use a third-party provider for my shopping cart or my website or whatever it is, let me go check their cybersecurity rating. And
Right.
that's a pressure point that you can use in order to get them to up their game a little bit and give yourself a little bit more of peace of mind.
Yeah, we also recommend looking at open source or standards tools like Mozilla Observatory that's available freely. Just go scan your website and you'll see what your rating is. And we did a study of a lot of the big retailers, and most of them have a rating of F, which is pretty much the lowest rating, 0 on 100. So I think we have a long way to go. That's the positive. I always look on the positive and say, look, this is an opportunity. It's a little bit scary in the short term, but I think companies are coming around. Look, we're out of time, Mounir. I wanted to thank you for this chat. It's been extremely useful for me, and I know based on the feedback that I'm already receiving that it's been very useful for the listeners. I would love for you to maybe join us again after the shopping season is done and see how it went. And for the listeners, if you have any questions, please email us at info@talasecurity.io. You can also sign up for a demo of Tala's capabilities or do a risk assessment on your website. I'll give you the final word, Mounir, and we'll close.
No, thank you very much, Anand. It's been a pleasure being here, and I'm glad that people like you and I are trying to keep our community a little bit safer during this shopping season.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Bye,
Thank you.
folks.